Shalom. It says in the Hagaddah, Rabban Gamliel Hayomer, Kol shelo amar shlosha dvarim elu bepesach lo yatsa yedei chovato. Anyone who didn't talk about these three items on Pesach didn't fulfill his obligation. And those three are Pesach, Matzah, Umaror. Why are these three things specifically what Rabban Gamliel chose that one must speak about at the Seder night? What is unique about them? Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, on his Perush on Chumash, in Shmot Perek Yud Bet Pasuk Chet, says something very interesting about these three items, the Korban Pesach, the Matzah, and the Maror. Says Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch that these three items symbolize three aspects of the Shibud Mitzrayim, of our hardship in Mitzrayim. First, Maror. Let's go backwards. Maror is very clear. It says in the Mishnah and in the Hagaddah, Maror al shum shemeru hamitzrim et chayei avotenu b'Mitzrayim, because the Egyptians embittered our forefathers' life in Mitzrayim. Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch says that this refers to the pain and suffering, both physically and emotionally, that Bnei Yisrael experienced in Mitzrayim. That pain and suffering is the first thing that we're commemorating out of these three. What about matzah? Well, matzah, says Rav Hirsch, is really the same ingredients as bread. It's flour and water. So what makes matzah different than bread? And the answer, of course, is time. Bread, you leave time for the bread to rise into dough. Whereas matzah, you're in a rush, and you bake it right away very quickly. Says Rav Hirsch that matzah symbolizes servitude. The fact that a slave's time is not his own. He's always on a rush. He always has to quickly go and do what his master wants immediately. So matzah symbolizes that second aspect of Shibud Mitzrayim, of slavery. What about Pesach? What aspect of Shibud Mitzrayim does it represent? Well, Rav Hirsch focuses on the fact that the Korban Pesach was cooked tzli eish, roasted on a spit. And says Rav Hirsch that roasted on a spit is a symbol of a people who have no basis, no land, floating in air. This is the situation of strangers. Rav Hirsch is saying that the Korban Pesach represents the fact that Bnei Yisrael were strangers, were homeless, were refugees in Mitzrayim. They didn't fit in, they didn't speak the language, and that was the third aspect of Shibud Mitzrayim. So the three aspects, therefore, of Korban Pesach, of Matzah and Maror, represent the feeling of homelessness, of slavery, and of suffering that Bnei Yisrael experienced in Mitzrayim. However, there really is another way to look at this triple of Korban Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. Let's go the other side of the coin. It says in the Hagaddah, when we're talking about the Korban Pesach, that it's al shum shepasach hamakom al batei avotenu b'Mitzrayim, that God passed over the Jew's house during Makat Bechorot. In other words, the Korban Pesach, according to the Hagaddah, doesn't represent suffering, it represents salvation, that Hashem saved Bnei Yisrael during Makat Bechorot. And also, let's just talk about the food itself, the Korban Pesach, which is roasted meat, roasted whole. If anything, that really seems to be the food of kings, Ochel Malachim. But what about matzah and maror? So the Or HaChaim HaKadosh has an interesting perush and an interesting comment on matzah and maror as well. He notes that Bnei Yisrael actually were commanded to eat matzah and maror on Rosh Chodesh Nisan of that year of Shibud Mitzrayim, when they were still slaves. How strange that is. Why would Bnei Yisrael have to be reminded, oh, remember when you were slaves, when they were still slaves? What's the point? So the Or HaChaim HaKadosh makes an interesting comment, and he says, apparently, when Bnei Yisrael were commanded to eat matzah and maror, it wasn't to remind them of slavery, it wasn't to remind them of suffering, but rather, he writes, according to this, Hashem commanded them because that is the way of those who eat roasted food. to eat something sharp with it because it is pleasant to taste. Similarly, writes the Orach Chaim, that matzah as well, crackers, it's good to eat them. It's delicious to eat them with roast meat. In other words, the Orach Chaim is saying that Pesach, matzah, and maror, as a food, is quite tasty, and therefore is not necessarily a symbol of servitude, but of freedom, of derech melachim, the way of kings. Is this a contradiction? Which is it? Are Pesach, matzah, and maror a symbol of slavery or a symbol of geula? I think the answer is that this is not a contradiction at all. They're both correct. Chazal say in terms of Sipur Yetziat Mitzrayim, in terms of the Pesach night, that we are supposed to be matchilin begnut u'misaymin b'shevach. We begin with the negative and we end with praise. We begin talking about servitude and we end talking about geula. Both of these elements must be discussed in order to fulfill our obligation of the night. And maybe that's why Rabban Gamliel said that Pesach, matzah, and maror, these three items, must be discussed on the Pesach night. Because all three of them really symbolize both sides of the coin. They symbolize the negatives of Shibud Mitzrayim, the homelessness, the servitude, the suffering, but they're also practically derech melachim. They are a food of kings. They're delicious. And therefore they really represent that transition from galut to geula. And I'll even add in one more point. Symbolically, they are all representative of difficulties of stress. But practically, says, according to the Orach Chaim, they're all fine. And maybe that's the way it is in our lives as well. In the past, we regard things, we see the negatives in them. But when we actually look back and we see them practically, we see God's hand, we see the geula. So let's, as we this Pesach night say the statement of Rabban Gamliel, Pesach, Matzah, Umaror, let's remember that all three of these items really represent the important transition of Pesach, from Galut to Geula, Matchilin Bignut, Umisaymin B'Shevach. And may we all be Zochim very soon to celebrate Pesach together, B'Yerushalayim HaBnuyah. Everyone, all our alumni, family and friends and students should have a Chag Kasher v'Sameach. Happy Pesach, everybody.